Welcome to episode 283 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak encouragement into the hearts of educators and get you informed and energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm talking with Dr. Deonna Smith about being rooted in joy and creating a classroom culture of equity, belonging, and care. Visit truthforteachers.com for an easy-to-read, easy-to-share version of this podcast episode. Did you hear that I've curated 4 Truth for Teachers playlists with the episodes I'm most proud of and that I think will help you the most? I've gone through 7 years of our back catalog and compiled these playlists that I think will help you find our best stuff. There's the Greatest Hits playlist, the Encouragement playlist, the Productivity playlist, and the Student Engagement playlist. Just go to truthforteachers.com/playlists and enter your email address. I'll send you the exact playlist that you want. I hope this helps you find the best of our podcast. Just go to truthforteachers.com/playlists. Also, if you enjoy this podcast, would you consider leaving a rating or review for Truth for Teachers on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts? It takes just a few seconds. You can click through right from your podcast player app, and there's a link in the show notes too. Every review helps boost visibility for Truth for Teachers, which means more educators are able to discover it. Leaving a review or even just clicking the star rating is one of the fastest, easiest ways to support the show, and your reviews mean so much to me. A huge thanks to everyone who has done this so far. I really appreciate it. My guest today is Dr. Deonna Smith, who is an advocate for educational justice. Deonna has worked as a classroom teacher and school administrator, and now works with educators who are ready to reimagine schools as sources of joy, liberation, and community building. You can learn more about Deonna and her work at deonnasmithconsulting.com, and the link is also in the show notes. You'll also learn more about her new book with the same title as this podcast episode, which is Rooted in Joy, Creating a Classroom Culture of Equity, Belonging, and Care. I know you'll enjoy hearing Deonna's passion and energizing wisdom and practical ideas as much as I have. Listen in. Deonna, what does it mean to be rooted in joy, and how did you uncover what that looks like in your own life and work?
Yeah, so I love this question because it really gets to the crux of really my educational philosophy. And what it means to be rooted in joy is to really radically and unapologetically center joy in your classroom in both like the academic and the classroom culture experience. And I think that at first that's kind of a head scratcher for people. They're like, well, do we need that? Is that necessary? But I think what the past couple of years have taught us, and what I've learned through my own pursuit of not only just like high quality instruction and solid pedagogy, but really transformative equity work, is that joy absolutely needs to be at the root and can't be an add on and something that we think about later, but rather needs to be something that's really, really a starting place and the soil from which our classroom culture and our classroom ecosystem grows. And the second part of that question, really what I did in my own work is, a lot of people, if you're familiar with me from Instagram, you know that I started off very much in the equity, DEI space, anti-racism, which I still very much am in. And I think that joy is really something that I found to kind of be the secret ingredient, the missing piece. And I used to talk about that a lot in my workshops. The secret ingredient is joy. The secret ingredient is joy. The reason why some of this equity work is feeling like it's really taxing or it's falling flat is because we don't have that joy, that understanding that like joy and all of that is resistance as well. So I really just through my own experience of fighting for educational equity, and then my experience as of a teacher, of being burnt out, of reflecting on my own experience as a student and how like joyful schools from my perception used to be and how much they've changed now, was really fundamental for me in realizing like, oh, this is something that we're missing, that used to work, but that we can get back.
I'm curious about what your experience in joyful schools was like. What do you feel like we've lost there? What used to be commonplace that is now not? Or maybe what was just something that was common in your experience?
Yeah, well, now I'll start by saying I went to a hippy dippy Montessori school. So very
Love
much
it.
during that. And when I tell you that like totally radically changed the way that I thought about school, I did K through 6. So a lot, you see a lot of, Montessori preschools, but I was there all of elementary.
Wow.
Um, and I just had a totally different relationship with like school. Like we were a lot less, routine, a lot less rote. There was a lot less talk of like these high stakes testing and rigor. And I think people, when they find out about equity work, they think that the thing that we have to dig in on is, getting up those standardized test scores for Black and Brown students. And that couldn't be further from the truth, because what I found, especially in working in schools in a response to so-called learning loss, is that now we want to take all of the fun stuff out of school and really double down on academics. Even well, we lost quote unquote all this learning in COVID, so we have to have more rigor and even more instructional time, and that is just not the answer, because it's taken the humanity and the life and the play and the inquiry and all of that out of school. And I think it's showing, because we're not seeing, the learning loss, so called, has not been regained, despite hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in standardized testing and, high stakes curriculum. So I think my own experience in reflecting on what it was like as a student in Montessori, and then watching how the demands on my students changed, working with kindergarteners, working with high schoolers, and really just seeing their joy and their luster erode because of the way that they have to show up in the classroom, being really demoralizing and dehumanizing, made me realize that until we get that piece back, they're not going to be able to thrive academically. So it has to start with that joy.
Hmm. My first few teaching years were in the Head Start program, which is a federally funded program for
Mhm.
low income families, preschoolers.
Yep.
And our classrooms were a joyful place, a joyful place. And when I moved up and started teaching higher grades, I started teaching at third grade, I could see the difference in
Right.
the kids, because it was no longer about exploring and following their interests and learning through play. Like I could see the difference in that. So I too feel like I've had that experience where I see a joy-filled classroom, and then I've also felt like I needed to teach in ways that were not joyful, and
Hmm.
just like yearning for that, to have that back, that excitement and that enthusiasm. And I feel like when teachers have those little moments with kids where there are those breakthroughs of joy and laughter and enthusiasm, that's the stuff that keeps teachers going. Like that's
Right.
the big motivator.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's kind of it kind of rang to me as silly that we would think that it's possible to ask these great asks of kids, to internalize all of these standards within a 9-month period without any inquiry, enthusiasm, like you said, without any. It's kind of crazy to think that, a 10-year-old is going to meet the demands that are already, in my view, a little astronomical,
Yeah.
without anything else in the classroom. Like, it can't just be academic. So I think, when you look at it like that, it becomes clear that you have to have the joy. And you hit on the other piece too, which is that it's so life-giving for teachers. Like, we got into this because of those little moments. Those are the memories that we hold. Those are the things that, we go home and we're like, okay, like maybe I do got one more year in me, right?
Mm.
It's those moments. So it is rejuvenating for teachers, and it's sustaining for students. So it makes everybody feel good. And, the powers that be, the district people love to hear that it also leads to more positive outcomes. Like, we know that joyful, equity-based practices lead to better outcomes for students too. So it's really a win-win-win.
Hmm. Okay, so let's get into it, and let's start by talking about our own internal work, because I really try to emphasize, as you do, that it's not just about what we're doing with students, but how we're showing up. Who
Yeah.
are we in the classroom, and how are we interacting with them? So Talk to us about the kind of internal work that educators need to do in order to create school based practices that are rooted in joy.
Yes, yes. And I always say, I used to say a curriculum is only as anti-racist as the teacher teaching it, and
Mm,
the classroom is only as joyful as the teacher teaching it. So
yes.
it really does start with you. And I think for people that are frustrated if they're like doing all of the things, but they're not seeing results, then my first question is like, how are you showing up to that space? So on the joy side, I also want to mention that for children to feel joyful at school, they have to be able to be their authentic and full selves. And that's not possible in spaces where their identity doesn't have, value and they don't feel that sense of belonging. So it's important for teachers to do internal work that's related to unpacking their own biases, their own identity work, all of that we would still traditionally think is nested under maybe culturally responsive teaching, but it is very critical for the joyful work as well. Because how am I going to be joyful if, who I am isn't celebrated in the classroom? I can't be joyful in that environment. So, and teachers don't intentionally exclude identities, but without examining your biases, you might be unintentionally doing that. So you always want to start with that internal work. And that looks like whether you're in an identity affinity group where you're unpacking that, whether you pick up the Racial Healing Handbook, whether you're, reading maybe another book, maybe Me and White Supremacy. There's a lot of different books that you can read about your identity work, or whether you're just engaging in those reflection-based practices that bring you more awareness about how you're showing up on the identity side. That is where the internal work starts. And then the other side of the internal work is you can't pour from an empty cup, right? So you need to be experiencing joy. You need to be making sure that your emotional needs are met, that you're getting the seven different types of rest, that you are feeling fulfilled socially, like that you're recharging, whatever that looks like for you. So if you're not able to find joy in your personal life, it's going to be hard for you to show up and really create that container for joy in your classroom. So that's another piece that's great for teachers when they realize like, oh, like taking care of myself and being my best self actually has benefits and payoff in the classroom as well.
What would you say to a teacher who's thinking, I know I need to experience more joy? We've been talking for the last few years about self care. I understand that all of this is important, but I don't even know where to start. Like, I'm just so busy and bogged down with things. Like, how do I find my joy? How do I find those ways that work for me to recharge?
Yeah, yeah. So that's a great question. One thing that I coach people a lot on are the seven different types of rest. And if you're listening, you should look that up because I think when we think about recharging, we have kind of a singular view that means like literally resting or like maybe binging, like something on Netflix. But rest can look differently. There's like a different type of rest called creative rest, and in creative rest, you are like rejuvenating yourself through engaging in different creative hobbies. So maybe you need to pick up, something creative, needlepoint or whatever it is, or coloring, there's different types of, there's sensory rest where you're taking a screen-free day. So I think a lot of it starts with understanding the type of rest that you're missing out on and getting that type of rest. And then another thing is just really start small. I think we think about like self-care, oh, I need to like go on this huge trip or I need to do this like big thing, or it can be really, really small. It can start with one day a week, 1 hour a week of carving out that time. And then I also highly recommend, especially if you're type A, is for you to actually schedule it, like make it an agenda item. Don't just wait to be like, okay, when everything's done, I'll get to my self-care. No, put it in your calendar, schedule it like Thursday from 4:30 when I get home to 7:30. That's my self-care time. And I'm going to go to yoga and get myself a little treat. And then I'm going to, break out whatever my crochet needles. I'm gonna do my crochet for a while, whatever it looks like for you. So I think scheduling it, learning about the seven different types of rest, and then really just starting small and not feeling overwhelmed with yourself, but just starting with one day a week is a great way to make that sustainable and actually actionable.
I love that. Yes. Schedule in that time, even if it's just one block a week. And then that is protected time for you. I will link to that resource about the 7 types of rest in the
Oh,
show
perfect.
notes too.
Great, great.
So let's talk about what it looks like to have a classroom that is rooted in joy. And we're going to get into the practical things about how to actually implement this. But I want to start with the vision because I think it's really important to be able to dream, to imagine something better than what we have currently and not just think within the constraints of our current limitations, but
Right.
what could actually be possible. And I know that's something that you're really big on too. So tell me about your vision. Like what would a classroom that is rooted in joy look like?
Yeah, and I think and it's so important to name like that you have to dream and first let go of the constraints because I know as soon as you start thinking you're going to think about a million ways why it's not possible. But
Right.
Robin Kelly and Bettina Love are scholars and they both talk about freedom dreaming and it's such an
Yes.
important exercise because you're allowing yourself to visualize what something else could look like and if you don't even allow your imagination to free yourself from the constraints of the reality, then you're never going to, we're never going to see that change. If we can't even in our dreams think about a world without whatever it is, maybe standardized testing, it's never going to happen in reality. So it's okay to dream a little bit, even if it seems unrealistic. So it starts with like unpacking and recognizing the way that our current system breaks down joy and breaks down, that identity work. Bettina Love, the again, huge Bettina Love fan, she would call
Hmm.
it spirit murdering, right? So I
Yes.
think to start, like, what is a classroom that's rooted in joy? Well, some things that I start pushing back with teachers on, like just the beginning is noise level. A classroom rooted in joy is not necessarily going to fit the rubric of level 1, level 2, level 3 all the time perfectly. That might not be what your classroom looks like. And then I like to think about the physical space is a joyful space is probably a space where students can be in community with each other with ease, and so that might not look like the typical rows and desks that we're used to. A joyful space, might be somewhere where there's more collaborative learning spaces. So when you think about joy, I like to think about first, like from a kid's perspective in this classroom, like what are things that are stopping me from being my full authentic self, kind of free to just show up as I am, and then work backwards from that. So for a lot of teachers, I recommend philosophically starting with what I call joy first, and that is really flipping your focus away from behavior management and more towards community building. And so when I look at classrooms, what I see is that teachers spend about 80% of their time trying to manage behavior and about 20% of their time building community. Maybe at the beginning of the year, it's more balanced because you're like starting off, but usually when you think about what you spend a lot of your time doing, as far as culture, it's probably responding, playing what I call whack-a-mole with student behavior. So, and I just encourage teachers to dream about flipping that. Like, what if you spend 80% of your time just thinking about how can I continue to build and strengthen this community of learners, and only 20% of my time responding to behavior? And it's a dream because at first, there's going to be a lot of behaviors for you to respond to, and that's just natural. But we're working towards shifting our focus away from control and like managing behaviors and into community and building those connections. So that's like kind of the philosophical concept that undergirds the freedom dreaming of a joyful classroom. And then like the really practical side is it just like looks like kids showing up as their authentic selves, being in community, learning in ways that are well suited to their learning habits and meeting them where they're at in their learning styles, and really decentering this kind of like banking model of the teacher has all of the knowledge and needs to get it into the students, but rather like knowledge is constructed and built in this like joyful collaborative community.
Hmm. When I think about a joyful place, I think about a place where I feel like there are, it feels personalized to me. I have things there that I like. I feel I'm in a comfortable chair. I have, maybe I'm able to have water nearby or a snack or I'm able to look at something that is pleasing to me, or have objects around that I enjoy or that are meaningful to me, or that celebrate something that are important to me, maybe photographs or something like that. And I'm
Right.
just thinking about how that plays out in the classroom. Like, just it doesn't even have to be something that the teacher is necessarily orchestrating. It's what you're saying. It's allowing kids to be their authentic selves and not try to shove them back in this box where, well, no, we all sit on these kinds of chairs, or no, we don't have this extra stuff on our desks, or
Right.
this is the standard way that our
Right.
classroom is going to look. And I think because teaching has been so standardized, it's really tempting to kind of make the way that we approach students more standardized. And I think that that personalization piece is so little but so powerful.
Right. And I think for some teachers, like they think like, oh, but it's so difficult to, personalize to every single student. But I always encourage them to think about this. In my experience, it was much harder to try to bully 30 kids into a cookie cutter mold, right? That they were
Mhm.
not, that wasn't working for them, than just kind of being flexible. So it's not that you have to like learn all this, every single eccentricity and want and need of every single student. It's just about being flexible with not trying to get them to conform. And if you really step back and think about like what teachers spend a lot of time doing, a lot of that is like trying to get students to fit into that cookie cutter mold. And there's a reason why it's so hard. And there's a reason why we're getting burnt out, because it's not meant to work that way. So a joyful classroom, you're absolutely right. It is personalized, and kids feel a sense of belonging in that space. And that is kind of like the baseline, right? Because you can't feel joyful unless you feel a sense of like belonging and that you have a place there. So it really all starts, it starts with that. And like you mentioned, there are a lot of passive ways that teachers can do that. And there's a lot of active ways that teachers can do that. But it really just starts with having the desire and the disposition of like, this classroom is going to intentionally push back on the ways that we try to make kids fit into a mold that kills that joy.
How does all of this fit into the importance of humanizing our students and humanizing our classroom? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, it is. Humanizing our kids is a huge, huge ask, and the dehumanization. I think it does to go back to that cookie cutter mold. It starts with that. It starts with you aren't a human in all of your complexity. You are a third grader, and this is what third graders do, right? And so I think it's important to recognize that this is the default. So for teachers, you have to understand like this is the way that things are naturally going to work. Schools are naturally going to be dehumanizing because they're designed to produce like results within a very, very narrow confines, right? It's supposed to be kind of like school is standardized. The idea is kind of like you create the standardized adult that can check all these boxes. So the dehumanization, even if you're listening to this and thinking like, oh, I don't dehumanize my students, the reality is schools are designed to do that. So humanizing has to be something that we're actively engaging in. And it just means seeing your kids for their full selves. And this is, again, to go back to the internal work, it is really hard to humanize a student, especially those students that really push you in a myriad of ways. Like the ones that you're up at night thinking about, the ones that you sometimes wish weren't on your roster. Those are the ones that it's hard to humanize unless you are very well yourself. Because if you're dysregulated, if you're escalated, if you're feeling dehumanized, you're not going to be able to hold that space for one of your babies, right? So it's really important to go back to that like wellness and wholeness as a person, um, because it's easy to dehumanize students when they're exhibiting these behaviors. And behaviors we have, according to the Department of Education, schools are reporting that behaviors are worse now than they ever were before the pandemic. And I think that's when a lot of the dehumanizing starts. It's the kids that are that their attention spans are really short because of the social media and information revolution that's happening. It's the kids that are like, they can't sit still. Their bodies are not able to move. It's the kids that are still dealing with trauma and are externalizing that on other kids in other ways. It's those kids that it's so easy for us to dehumanize because we get caught up in the frustration in responding to those behaviors. So that's why it's absolutely critical to go back to that internal work. And when you're humanizing your students, it's everybody. That's the other ask of a joyful community. It's not, joyful for my students that are behaving. It's not joyful, to everybody whose clip is on green today. It's this is a community and everybody has to have a space. So it's important to humanize and have that radical humanization of like, when we say humanize, we mean everybody, even the ones that, the ones whose parents you can't seem to get a hold of, but seem to never miss a day of school. So those that is a big ask. And for me personally, I've seen a lot of teachers dehumanize students coming from a place of frustration and dysregulation, but it ends up like really altering the kids' experience. Like when they feel dehumanized or when they feel rejected from their teacher and their community space, especially when you like I used to work with middle school and high school, right? It can totally transform your relationship with school, with yourself, and really send kids like not even to exaggerate down the school to prison pipeline. So it can be a very high stakes thing to keep that be rooted in your students' humanity and your own humanity as well.
Another way that I know you think about humanizing students and creating this class culture is really seeing the classroom as an ecosystem. And I know you've written about that in your book, in which in an ecosystem, every being is interdependent. And that really rings true to me because when we make changes to any one aspect of an ecosystem, either the classroom ecosystem or a different type, any little change just creates this ripple effect, and we
Mhm.
have intended and unintended consequences. And I think that this holistic view of seeing the classroom as a whole ecosystem, it's not this thing where, oh, if I could just turn off this one behavior and make kids, pay attention or show up to class on time or turn in their work. There's a whole ecosystem of factors there. And I would love to hear what your thoughts are on this concept of a classroom ecosystem.
Yeah. And you know what? It really came to me because I was okay. So when I coach on academics, I always talk about discussion should be soccer and not tennis. So it's not going back and forth between the teacher and individual students, but it's soccer, like the ball is moving over here, it's moving over there, it's an exchange. And I wanted to capture that same idea for the classroom culture. Because a lot of times when we think about classroom culture, we think about the teacher and the student. Like I'm the teacher, I'm at the center, and it's like I'm interacting with each of these kids, and it's my job to build a relationship with each of these individual kids. And that is true, but it's also like the teacher is not kind of the center focal point. Instead, it's all of these interdependent relationships with each other of this ecosystem. And in the same way, when you think about an ecosystem, this is what I used to teach, in fifth grade, the ecosystem is dependent on its environment, right? And there's environmental factors. So like the ecosystem could be going really well and then the environment could throw it off. So I thought that that was a good analogy because there is, there is the physical space. There is even the time of year. Everybody knows like kindergartners in September are totally different people than kindergartners in June. So there's all these external factors that are also impacting the ecosystem. But I think when you start to think about it like that, it takes some of the pressure off of the teacher as being like the center focal point and has all this responsibility to, like make it all happen. But instead, like you're building and helping to create this healthy ecosystem. And when the ecosystem is healthy, it continues to grow and expand upon itself, right? It like kind of like starts this chain reaction and then it gets better and better. It's not just, one person kind of working away. So I want teachers to think about their classrooms as ecosystems, and how like different interventions can bring healthy changes to the ecosystem and continue to make it grow. But the ecosystem is also always moving and always maintaining. So it's not a stagnant kind of thing where it's the ecosystem is like there, it's done. It's always, kind of growing and changing and shifting. So that's the relationship that I hope teachers will feel excited about having with their classrooms and their classroom culture.
Yeah, that's got me excited. Like I love the idea of thinking about it that way. You're right, it takes so much pressure off, to be the fixer or to be the one who, creates the whole environment. But, an environment or an ecosystem is it's a living thing created
Right.
of all of these living beings, and each one impacts it and each one creates a ripple effect with their actions and their choices, and it grows over time, it changes over time. Yes, I love it. So, talk to us about some specific practices that teachers can implement to create a classroom culture that is really mindful of this ecosystem and really integrates equity, belonging, and care, as you talk about in your book.
Yeah, yeah. So I would say the first thing, especially if you're not in school, if you're not, back to school yet, I know some people are already back, but if you're not back yet, is really thinking about how you are going to show up as a member of the ecosystem. So really starting with you, starting with your own work, starting with your own reflection and with your own wellness and wholeness. I talk a lot about it in the book about like not only being well, like emotionally well, but being whole, feeling that sense of
Mm.
wholeness and rightness with yourself. So I would say start there. And then I would think about like a low lever or a very like high lever task, but like low effort is to think about the physical space. So, as your classroom oriented towards building community, I would then start to think about really honing in on the first 2 weeks. Or if you're listening to this later, take 2 weeks to really intentionally build that community. And what that should look like is like every day there should be an opportunity for 2 weeks. Every day there should be an opportunity for kids to reflect and share on their own identity, who they are, and an opportunity for kids to reflect and share on how they are going to show up in community with each other. And so think about like, okay, for 2 weeks, you want at least one activity each day that's an identity activity and one activity each day that's a community building activity. And then watch how that foundation kind of transforms. Because I guarantee you, if you do that, you'll start to see some really big changes. And then think about daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly celebrations of joy. And so now, when you're doing your lesson plans or you're looking at your week at a glance, just take 10 minutes each day and think about, okay, where's a moment where we will be joyful and excited with each other? That could look like a myriad of different things. Maybe you have a really high interest project in science that you know is just going to be super fun. Maybe it's a 10 extra minutes of recess. Maybe it is kids get to bring in like even a community meeting and they're bringing in a show and tell. Maybe you find the funniest meme that you saw this week and bring it into class. Whatever it is, you want to think about daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly moments of joy. And the monthly stuff should be like classroom celebrations. And then the yearly stuff, I always like to tie to something big like a classroom field day or some sort of rite of passage that they can look to. But the monthly stuff, you can also bring in that identity. Like when I think about monthly joy, I think about connecting it to whatever culture month we're celebrating. So whether it's Latino heritage between September and October, or Filipino heritage in October, or Indigenous Peoples Month in November, or you're doing Black History Month in February, how can you make those joyful and also identity building experiences? So it starts with like, I mean, the same way when you think about planning your curriculum, I know it sounds weird, but if the joy isn't happening, plan it. If the community building isn't happening, intentionally plan it and sit down and make those activities happen. And it might seem like, okay, like I'm just checking off a box, but the tangible results will be there in the health of your ecosystem.
Yeah, that's a really great point about planning. Like that doesn't make it inauthentic because you
Right.
plan to have a moment of joy.
Right.
What it
Exactly.
means is it is a priority and
Right.
you are therefore scheduling in time, just like you mentioned earlier about scheduling in that time for, rest, whatever kind of rest it is that you need.
Yes.
We don't have to just wait for these things to happen because often they won't. We have
Right.
to plan for them.
Yes, absolutely. That's the thing. Like if you that it's shifting your mindset to understanding that it's kind of like Beverly Tatum talks about racism as a moving walkway, like in the airport. Like it's already moving towards not being joyful. Like school as a default is moving away from joy and belonging and care. So if you're not doing anything, you're already moving away from that. So to bring that in, sometimes you have to actively walk, right? You have to actively walk against that and plan it in and say like, no, I'm going to, despite, you're probably getting a lot of pressure from your admin to like get bell to bell instruction or like, how are you using your instruction minutes? But intentionally saying, no, every day I'm going to do a community builder and an identity builder for 2 weeks because that's going to make my classroom rooted in joy. So that's a way that we're disrupting, right? We're disrupting these harmful practices in education.
So I would love for you to tell us where we can find more resources related to this, especially if teachers are thinking about, doing these identity-based practices at the start of the school year and thinking about joyful practices. Tell us about your favorite resources that can make this easier for teachers. Tell us about where they can connect with you and learn more from you, and then share with us our takeaway truth, which is something that you wish every educator listening understood about doing work that's rooted in joy.
Yeah, yeah. So I would say for me, resources, well, one, obviously I'll say if you're on my newsletter, you get resources. Like I send out a weekly newsletter with resources and information that all is kind of in this wheelhouse, kind of like anti-racism, culture responsive teaching, and joy are my main topics that I rotate through. So make sure you're on the monthly or the weekly newsletter. And then obviously my book, Rooted in Joy, is all about the subject. It's meant to be something that combines theory and practice. So there is theory in it, but it's also very orientated towards what can you do? Like, what are the actual practices? How can I make this tangible and sticky? So there is a whole chapter dedicated to implementing all of this stuff here. So check out my book, Rooted in Joy. And I also regularly offer, workshops and that kind of thing with teachers. I go to schools and do workshops. And then for me, when I'm trying to figure out what this looks like on my own, I do a lot of learning from folks on Instagram. And then I do a lot of learning from other teachers who are out here every day doing the work. So whether you're looking, at Naomi O'Brien and Lanisha Tab, they have a really great Teachers Pay Teacher store with a lot of resources. Or you're using, other folks like Liz Kleinrock has a lot of resources. As someone else is coming to mind. So I do a lot of looking to other teachers and seeing what they're doing. I would say start there. And one thing that I always like to end with and share with folks is that this is not one more thing, because I know as teachers we can be really resistant and cautious about like, oh, is this like another thing that we're doing, because we're doing all of the things and it feels like we can't take one more thing. But when you start to build your classroom ecosystem, it makes it more sustainable for you. It makes it easier for you, more joyful. So this isn't one more thing. It's really really transforming the way that you structure your classroom so that it can be more sustainable for yourself and joyful for your students. So if you do a little bit of the work on the front end, it pays off big time on the back end.